Hi, I'm Jules Ostara. Welcome to my home here in the Blue Ridge Mountains. This is my basement, studio, sanctuary, and playroom. So thank you for joining me and let's have some fun today. I'm going to be doing my own twist on Inktober and Oktoberfest for Inktoberfest and a series of videos. So I'm going to be using alcohol inks in the theme of Oktoberfest and hence the beer mug. Here. The beer mug behind me, which I've gathered a bouquet in instead of brew today to honor Oktoberfest and all the brewers out there. My husband used to home brew before we mostly cut alcohol out for various reasons. So I'm playing with alcohol ink. So this is my 12 pack that I'm going to be using and various colors of alcohol inks. Each week, I'm going to be unboxing a new pack and doing new projects, a few different projects. I don't usually use alcohol ink as my primary medium, my primary art supply. I usually use it more as accents in my other work and for the special effects it can give. So these might be different two sorts of projects than what you might usually find in an alcohol ink tutorial. So I'm going to be exploring and learning and growing along with you in some ways, but I also think that is where makes a lot of room for discoveries, because when we are not already trained that this is how you use it or this is how you do it, then you're free to explore and experiment and see what kind of sweet surprises and discoveries you make. The projects that I'm going to make for this first video, here's my favorites. I did a few different, I just love how these came out. I had never worked on this surface in this way before. These are against the white paper just so that you can see the colors better on the camera. So that's one of the things we're creating in this video. And first we do a few warm-up projects to get going and just to check out the colors and the supplies before doing that one. And one of those from the warm-up goes through quite a transformation, which I'm going to make you stick around to the end if you want to see. It was a lot of fun and it's a little bit wild, and I love the creative process because it's a safe place to do that. Be sure to subscribe if you'd like to follow along for the rest of the series. And you might also want to subscribe to my email because I share lots of additional specials for email acquaintances, and I do giveaways reserved especially for them, for current subscribers seasonally. So you might want to get in on that too. You can get a supply list below the video and links for all of that. Here we go. Cheers. So I'm using watercolor paper, just an inexpensive watercolor paper. I have a few other supplies collected that I'm probably going to use, some white watercolor paint and acrylic gouache, the alcohol ink obviously, and then these invisible gloves, which I use even if I don't know how well it actually protects your hands in terms of the chemicals. However, it definitely makes it easier to wash the paint and ink off of your fingers, especially the fingertips. And then I have a few different brushes. I really love this one that holds a lot of water, and then some other options. Substitute whatever you have if you want to play along. All right, opening the box, or package in this case. And these colors, I love the names of the colors. In this one I have Wild Plum, Stream, and Butterscotch. Doesn't that sound yummy? Spray bottle with water, because I always have that available. And I'm starting out with some white watercolor paint. That is a new tube for me, going along with the unboxing theme. It is Van Gogh, which was just an affordable brand that I found available to throw in with some other supplies that I was ordering and just give it a try. And I'm using that Mandalay brush with a fair amount of water and additional water that I sprayed. I forgot to spray the paper before I started on the back, which will help it prevent it from buckling up so badly. So I added a little spray to the back of both pieces there, thinking I'll end up working on both of them eventually. And now coming in on the one that I added the white watercolor layer first, now adding the alcohol ink on top of that. Decided to start with butterscotch because that just sounded fun to me. And I'm adding little bits right in because it's already wet and because it has that layer of watercolor paint that would change the effect is different than what I would get if I were working on dry paper. So if you haven't worked with any supply, whether it's alcohol ink or anything, I definitely recommend you experiment on all sorts of surfaces and with all different, whether it's wet or dry, and whether you're working into different types of materials, acrylic or watercolor, and see how all those different affects what you get. So that's part of the fun of this process right now, unboxing, putting it on inexpensive paper. I've not got any plan that these need to be any kind of masterpiece, free to do anything. Anything goes. And here I'm just using the wet brush to help spread. So you can see that this is a porous surface, right, on the watercolor paper, very absorbent, which means that that alcohol ink is getting absorbed quickly, and so I can go right over it with this very wet brush, and most of the marks are staying pretty well in place. They soak in quickly and pretty permanent, so I can't change those marks very much, which I can use to my advantage, because when I was working into that wet white watercolor, some of that color from the inks is going to tint that other paint for the background. So that's how I got that very subtle the color and tint in the background on the piece on the right. Now moving over to the piece on the left, just got it kind of started with what was left on the brush. Now I'm opening this for the first time, which is a Liquitex acrylic gouache. What I really like about it, and I didn't know was going to be the case, is that it has two different types of lids. So I had to open the full thing to get that protector thing out, but then you can see it also has this cool tip for squeezing small amounts out. So I really like that, putting it as the first layer, knowing that I want some white to work into on the background. It keeps it brighter with the alcohol ink, and it gives the alcohol ink something to react with, which is really what I wanted it for. Spreading that out again with the very wet brush, and now using a pine cone for inspiration, I decided I might give myself a little bit of a design that I could then come into with the alcohol ink. So I'm using that ink pen, which I needed to get going. It wasn't flowing very well there on the right, but right into the wet. And I've used this one that way before because I know that I get some fun effects when it starts to blur, even though it's a waterproof ink once it dries. If you're working with it into wet like this, it's going to bleed, and I like the cool effect that happens with that. So I was just not knowing where I wanted to go next, so that's why I brought in a few shapes, a little bit of structure from that pine cone, and then coming in with the butterscotch again here in the background, working into it pretty quickly to see how fast does it really disappear into the paper, and how much time and how much can I move it around from putting it there on the paper. If I had been putting the ink in a palette, a plastic palette, and then using it on the paper, I probably would have had a very different experience working with it that way. So try all the different ways. I love doing this. I love letting it splatter. I love the spontaneity. I want to enjoy the process just as much as the product. And I've learned from doing it so many times that you can always change it. You can always transform it. You can tear it up and use it in different pieces that way. You can paint over it. So especially in a first layer for me, that is the place to be free, have fun, play like a kid, and sometimes try different things with your supplies. See, if you work with the pen right into the wet, working with the alcohol inks into the wet white paint, and spreading it around different types of brush tips. So this tip's a little bit stiffer. I'm getting a bit different effect and experience than what I had on the one on the right, where I was coming over it with that very soft, very wet brush. And the one on the right was also going into a watercolor paint, whereas the one on the left is going in to the acrylic gouache. Now just coming in to let myself doodle with the pen, still working on a wet paper, so I know that I'm not worried about it holding its shape. It's going to probably blur some, and that can be fun too. I'm not using any reference imagery right now. I am doing some similar marks to ones I've done many times before in my sketchbook or in other paintings, playing with filling in the space and how I fill the space in this one a little differently and a little more than the one that was on the right that had such an open space and very light and airy feel. And while the one on the left still does have that, you can see that I'm starting to fill it a bit more. And I noticed there I've got a smiley face, what seems like a smiley face there on the left with the two kind of turquoise stream color eyes and then like a pink mouth below. And even that kind of makes me happy at this point, at this stage in it, just letting it be silly and sweet and scribble. And deciding to add some of the pen over to the one on the right as well, just little bits that kind of remind me of little seed pods floating in the air, something like that, or berries, I don't even know, but it's a shape that I've made a lot of times and that I enjoy doing. So when in doubt, if you have kept a sketchbook, if you have a practice that you have learned some marks that you enjoy, those can become your kind of go-to marks when you don't know what you want to do next. So then I set those aside to dry, and I have this container that I think had croissants in it. Croissants? How do you say that? That I'm going to use here. So I'm just cutting it down to get a flat piece out of the top. I was taking the sticker off of the area that I'm going to use. You want to be careful for any sharp edges while cutting it. And I'm obviously not worrying too much about cutting in a straight line. That I can clean up a little bit later. I just wanted to get the biggest flat piece so that I could use it as a painting surface and then make sure it's clean. So usually I would wash it with soap and water in the sink and then come in and dry it with a paper towel. I was just putting it over a clean white piece of watercolor paper so that you could see better. And then I started by coming right in with that stream colored, blue colored alcohol ink before I remembered I wanted the white on it. So then adding some white watercolor paint, because I'm just kind of curious what the watercolor paint will do on this plastic surface. And then coming back in with that wet Mandalay brush to see how much can I spread the alcohol ink on this plastic. How does it react? Very different than working on the watercolor paper to work onto this plastic non-porous surface, which is more similar to what's typically recommended, I think, for using alcohol inks. But I've used them successfully on all different kinds of surfaces in different ways. You just get different effects with it. So I'm still in experiment mode. Let's see how much can I pull the alcohol ink on this surface as opposed to the paper. How much can I change it, and how much does that original initial line stay put, and how much can I manipulate that? Starting to play a little bit more with composition in this one. I was definitely in the watercolor paper also thinking about that, the way that I made the marks and spread them out. Now starting to think a little bit more about that on this one, using a mixed media paper to lift. What happens? What if? Still in what if mode, which is a fun place to be. I'll set that aside and I can use that for something else later. But I wasn't in love with where this was, and I wanted to get a feel what happens with the plastic if I try to lift it versus on a paper. Try a few Etch-a-Sketch type style drips, and then coming back in because I lost a lot of that vibrancy that the alcohol ink gives when I lifted it. So bringing it back in, working with different speeds, seeing if I work with it pretty quickly, do I get a different effect than when I let it sit for a little bit longer, because even on the plastic on that bottom where I did the swirly, ripply thing at the very first marks I made on this, you can still see because I didn't move them around quickly. So definitely noticing how much the speed that I'm working with makes a difference in how the alcohol ink is laying on my surface and how quickly it's drying and staying. And then lifting it up, just because I'm working on this clear surface, I want to get a feel and sometimes look at it and see it a little differently. Now finally coming in with the butterscotch, which made me happy. It brightened it up and added that warmth. And coming back in with some more white for the same reason. I like that it helps the other colors kind of shine. And that was a slightly different product. That was the Liquitex acrylic ink rather than the gouache. Knowing it's something that I had already used many times in the past, so I have a better sense of how it plays with the colors and the different products. So I brought that in knowing that it would hold its own pretty well with them and also get some cool effects. It plays a great supporting role with the other colors and within the composition to give the eye room to kind of rest in certain areas, a break from the bright boldness of some of the other colors. But I did want to bring more of that pinky magenta wild plum color in, which I'm loving. Just cleaning the brush off there on that other piece of paper. And while I was giving a little bit of thought to the composition, I'm mostly trusting what I'm enjoying. So I like those colors, I like the distribution and the flow and the rhythm that's happening. I'm adding more of the butterscotch in the areas that intuitively feel like they want it, kind of listening to the piece and to my own preferences and nudges and whispers of what do I like and what do I not like. Oh, I maybe want this to come a little more here because I didn't like the way it was in a particular way, so how can I shift that to something that I love? And enjoying the process, still watching the ink and how it's mingling and how it's moving without too much pressure for what the final piece is going to be, knowing that I can change it, that I can cut it up if I want to. So that gives me that freedom to not worry too much about the whole and be able to focus on areas within it that I want to add a little more of this color to, and also continue to experiment. They're seeing what happens if I kind of scrub the alcohol ink in this spot. What effect do I get? And now playing a bit with the saturation, the amount of water or paint that is mixed in with the ink and in different areas. So some spots are darker and some spots are lighter. Now it has had time to mostly dry, which was at least several hours before I came in and used that paper towel to just dry the one area that wasn't yet. Now checking the rest of it to see if the rest of it's fully dry so that I can come in, play with it, deciding I'm going to cut it. I thought it might make really cool sun catchers that you could make to hang in the window. So I was gonna cut it into even smaller pieces, but when I started looking at the different areas, I really liked this spot. This was my favorite. So I focused in, zoomed in to find my favorite part of the whole piece, and that's this part here that I then obviously used the scissors to cut. I probably could have used a straight edge paper cutter and cleaned it up a little more. That can be done later or not. Sometimes I like a little bit of wonkiness, a little bit of imperfection. That is part of the energy in accepting that and even appreciating that. So setting that one aside, which I love, deciding if I want to cut it any more or if I want to leave this as it is. Also noticing that a few of these edges, while I like wonky, I did want it to be flat. And there were a few parts where that still had kind of a lip or a raised edge from the original packaging that I needed to clean up. So that part I did want to make sure it was not having those areas. I don't want you to necessarily know that I repurposed some food container, even though I'm glad to do so to reduce waste and make something cool and fun in the process. So you can see I'm going for very abstract here. I wasn't intending for those to necessarily represent anything, but I love them. 2 thumbs up, which reminds me, if you are enjoying this video, please give it a thumbs up. It does help for others to maybe get to enjoy it as well, get to find it and play along with us. So now this is the only section that I felt needed some attention, that I wasn't in love with as it was. It was kind of boring. I'm coming back in with some more of those alcohol inks, very loose and free, not caring too much. I have 2 pieces over there that I really enjoy, so this one can, not a big deal if I like it or if I don't. Inspired both by the ones on the left, bringing more of the other 2 colors into this one, letting those cheer me on while I'm making it, using a chopstick here and kind of etching into the alcohol ink, scratching some of it away, which means that I am going to need to pay attention to how I protect these and seal them once they're finished. So I didn't include that in the video. I will end up experimenting with a few different kinds of sealant or varnishes on the different ones to see what works best. Coming in with now some white alcohol ink, which I had in a different brand, just to see how does that react with it as opposed to the other products that I used to bring in a white color. And I ended up fiddling with this one quite a bit, to coming back and forth in with white alcohol ink and then the butterscotch and back and forth some more, and then I eventually brought in the white acrylic ink instead of the alcohol ink to see if that would give me more of the effect that I kind of wanted or thought I might prefer there. I skipped forward just a little bit to this part, and I have learned that when I start getting kind of finicky like that, that it's usually getting close to time for me to take a break, at least from that specific piece, because I don't want to lose the free-flowing, fun energy that it had. So I brought that back in with one last splatter and then moving on to a different piece. So this one was dry and it was just a marvelous mess, you know, funky, fun, but nothing that I would use the way it is in that way. So I'm adding watercolor paint to it in a few colors, lime green, I think, with this wet brush helping it just flow all around. It's relatively translucent, so I'm not losing all of my under layers, but I'm adding depth to it. And I like pieces that have a lot of depth and a lot of layers, and sometimes that's kind of what they demand, at least in my experience and process. And I also love pieces that flowed forth in pretty fast, single or very few layers, like those ones on the left there that were on the plastic. So there seems to be a time and a season for different things, that ease and flow like the ones on the left, and then sometimes some are more complex. There's more intricacy and more complexity, and it makes them rich in that way. And it's nice to know that you can add more layers and turn it into something that you enjoy if you want to. So this one, I'm coming in now with an acrylic paint, that vibrant, bright orange acrylic paint. When in doubt, add something that makes you happy. This makes me happy. So I'm liking, it's kind of like a pumpkin orange, which feels good for October. Fun, it works well with some of the other colors that are happening here. And it's going to be a little bit thicker, even though it's an inexpensive acrylic paint. It's not heavy body. You can still see through it some, but it covers it up a little bit more than the watercolor paint was doing that I was using before. And there's a letting go in that part of the process that feels good. It can feel good to let go of things that aren't serving us, and that also feels like a good energy going along with fall and the falling leaves and the trees letting go, that we can let go of the areas in our art that we don't love. No need to get too attached to something like this. So using the putty knife, that paint scraper, to come in with some white acrylic paint and let go of the areas underneath, change it up, change is in the air. And using different tools like that putty knife and my fingers sometimes helps me to not be paying too much attention, to not be too tight, to not be too precise. And then bigger brushes, long handle brushes, all of those help me. Maybe you don't need that, but I need that reminder and assistance to play sometimes and to not try to control it so much. And I think that's something that appeals to me in art. I am drawn to art that has that feeling of freedom and play and joy that may or may not be what appeals to you. So to each their own. If you decide to try something similar, then it's trying it on the process and you'll see if it feels like a good fit for you or not. I didn't even really know about all these other ways to get creative that you can focus more on the process and the energy when I was young. So I am an advocate for at least trying it for those who may not think they can draw. Now coming in with a stencil, I made a similar stencil in the Year of Color course for this year in my second session for that. You can see a link for more information about that in the description for the video. There are several artist guides for 52 full weeks of creative sessions and explorations. So one of mine, I make stencils like this and would love to have you join us. Bringing in another ink another kind of ink with that ink spray here through the stencil. I laid it right down over all the wet paint and only sprayed in a few areas to get this fun, cool effect, and I love it. It just transformed it, right? So I set aside briefly just so that I could clean the stencil off using another piece of watercolor paper underneath it and just rolling because there was still that ink on that side, to get that fun piece, and then I can use that for something else, just cleaning it off and not wasting that ink and not letting it dry on the stencil. And then I let this, there was that wet spot I just pointed out where there was like a pool of water. I should have lifted that. You can see that that was affecting the ink, but I still love it. 2 thumbs up. Bravo if you've played along and created something yourself. If you'd like to dive deeper into the art of transformation, that's what we do in the Painted Ladies online course that I host. I hope you've enjoyed these creative projects and playing along with some alcohol ink to celebrate Inktoberfest. Thanks again for joining me. Remember to subscribe and share with any art friends if you know others that might enjoy this as well.